As I shared in yesterday's video, perhaps the most significant evidence that Jesus was who he claimed he was is in the evidence we have for the resurrection. So we do need to explore that. We need to ask the question, did Jesus really come back to life again after he had died? Well, we're fortunate near here that the National Film Archive isn't far away. And I went digging around through some of their more ancient footage a few weeks ago, and I came across this item from Jerusalem Lunchtime News in 33 AD. Genuine and authentic, of course. Let's see what they had to say.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Saad Yusi. And this is Jerusalem Lunchtime News. It is 33 AD and the time is 1 PM. The weather is hot and the forecast all day is sun, sun, sun and more sun. So if you're going out, don't forget your head sauce. The main news this morning is all about the sun. Not the sun in the sky, but the man called Jesus who claimed he was the Son of God. He was crucified last Friday, but even after his death, it seems like there's a new controversy brewing. We go now to our eyewitness news reporter in Jerusalem, Farah C. Can you hear me, Farah? What's happening over there?
Well, Sad,
it's very exciting out here, and the Sanhedrin are getting a little upset, I can tell you.
What's happened?
Well, earlier this morning, the tomb that Jesus was meant to be in was open, and the body was gone.
What do you mean someone took it?
Well, that's what people thought initially, but now his disciples have said that God has raised him, and Jesus is alive.
Well, that sounds like nonsense. It was probably the Jewish or Roman authorities that took the body.
Well, they didn't take the body, because otherwise, if they had the body, they would produce the body to show everyone that he was dead. But they don't have the body, so they can't produce it.
Well, okay, but what if the disciples took it?
Well, they wouldn't do that, because they were really scared the night that he was crucified. But now they had a whole change of heart, and they're spreading around saying Jesus is alive. They've seen a miracle.
Seen him alive? Well, I just can't believe that. Maybe he wasn't dead in the first place. Maybe he just fainted and they thought he was dead. And then when he came round in the tomb, he escaped.
Well, that's impossible. The Romans know what they're doing. They can kill people easily. They even poked him with a spear to see if he was dead.
Well, maybe they just crucified the wrong man. And Jesus waited until it was all over to come out of hiding.
That's nonsense, Sad. Everyone knows what Jesus looks like. And if they put anyone who wasn't Jesus on the cross, they would have noticed. And all the evidence points back from the fact that he has indeed come back from the dead.
Well, there must be another explanation. Once all the fuss has died down and his followers give up on this nonsense, then maybe the real truth will come out. And when it does, we'll be here to bring the story to you. This is Saad Yusi, signing off and wishing you a good afternoon.
Well, Saad Yusi certainly looks young to be a TV anchorman, but I guess they didn't have the same legislation about child labour back then. In case you don't know them, that was two of my children from about 14 years ago. All a bit of fun, but it does help to make the point. There have been many attempts to explain away the evidence for the resurrection. So, for example, one of the earliest attempts we read about in Matthew's Gospel, where the Jewish authorities said, put the word around that the disciples took the body. But that doesn't make sense, because if the disciples had stolen the body, these were the guys that were in hiding. They were the ones that had run away when Jesus was captured. We know them hiding away in the upper room, while the women were the ones that went out to the tomb. We know that the disciples were willing to go to their death in the end for what they believed to be true about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which they wouldn't have done if they'd perpetrated some sort of hoax, having taken the body in the first place. So the disciples can't have stolen the body. Another attempt to try and explain away the evidence was that, well, maybe the authorities stole the body. But as Pharisee pointed out in that sketch, if they had, well, they would have produced Jesus' body to say, well, here he is, so he can't be resurrected as you're claiming because we have the body here. What about if someone else has stolen it? Maybe it was stolen just by thieves. But if thieves had taken it, the only really valuable thing worth having were the grave clothes, and those were left behind. So that doesn't make sense. Maybe Jesus wasn't dead at all. Maybe, he'd sort of not quite died on the cross when they put him in the tomb. But Romans know what they're doing. They'd flogged him within an inch of his life before they even crucified him. He was on the cross for hours and died. And to prove he was dead, a soldier pierced him in the side with a spear. Jesus was dead. And if you want to see more of the evidence for that broken down, watch the video on my left to your right by Lee Strobel, where he looks specifically at that part of the equation in his 4 elements of proof of the resurrection. Maybe the disciples were hallucinating. Maybe they were full of grief and remorse, and they thought they saw Jesus in all of their grief, but that wasn't the case. And I admit, when I've been visiting people who have lost someone that they've loved, occasionally you'll hear them talking about how they have a sense of the person that they've loved and lost still being with them. But it's not a physical manifestation, and certainly not to a large group at the same time, not to all 11 apostles. And it certainly doesn't explain how Saul himself encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, because Saul was a non-believer. He wasn't full of grief, but he had an encounter with the risen Jesus Christ. So it wasn't a hallucination. If we just forget the biblical account for a moment and look instead at the evidence of what happened in history around that time. Tom Wright, a historian and theologian, says that the biblical explanation of the resurrection is by far the best explanation we have to fit all of the other data outside of what we see within the Bible. The illustration he uses is imagining that you're an archaeologist and you're excavating in an area and you find 2 ancient columns that have fallen over on the ground. And as you excavate them and examine them, it seems as though there ought to be an arch that went between those 2 columns, and it would be about this size. And as you excavate a bit further in an area nearby, you found an arch that so exactly fits where those columns would have been. You say, well, this arch must have fitted on these columns. It fits perfectly. There we've solved the problem. And if we look at early Christianity, at the explosion of this Jesus movement, the claims about his messiahship, the transformation of the Jewish belief about the resurrection to the Christian shape and more, it really looks as though this Jesus that they're talking about was bodily raised from the dead. And then we find the stories of the Gospels that so exactly fit all the other evidence. But that's when the skeptics would say, well, you're not allowed to use that arch, that's off limits. But there are no other arches that fit the evidence. All these different attempts to try and explain it away, they don't come close. Tom Wright says he studied all of them intensively. And all of them score that. He says, by his words, they are pathetic. It's not as though they score 6 or 7 out of 10. They rate at best 1 or 2 out of 10 in matching the evidence. However, he says, the biblical account of the resurrection so exactly fits the evidence that it scores a straight 10. The evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is huge. All the evidence seems to point to the fact that Jesus was and is who he claimed to be. But there's one more bit of evidence that I'd like to explore before we wrap up this week's set of videos. But that's a topic for tomorrow. I hope you can join us.